When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
70,000 people are here, and then Bob Dylan is the reason for it.
Inspired by the true story.
If anyone is going to hold your attention on a stage, you have to kind of be a freak.
Are you a freak?
Hope so.
And starring Timothy Chalamet as Bob Dylan. He defied everyone.
Turn it down!
Play loud!
To change everything.
Make some noise, BD.
Timothy Chalamet, Edward Norton, Elle Fanning, Monica Barbaro. A complete unknown. Only in theaters Christmas Day. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without parent.
Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcasts, and Killer Podcast presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
She was a high school senior, a daughter, sister, and friend. 5 years ago, Maggie Long was murdered, and her killer still hasn't been caught. Maggie was a senior at Platte Canyon High School when she was found dead in her home. She had stopped there to bring water and cookies to a school concert that night. Investigators say she was attacked in the home in Bailey before the house was set on fire. They believe at least 3, maybe 4 suspects were involved in her death. Last year, the FBI announced it was investigating her death as a hate crime. Colorado Bureau of Investigation says they've received 237 tips in Maggie's case. $75,000 reward is being offered for information.
The community of Bailey once again being asked for tips to help solve the murder of Maggie Long. The high school senior was killed in her home 5 years ago.
Investigators say she was set on fire, burned alive.
We know for a fact that there was at least 3 people, 3 males, possibly 4 people involved in this case.
A person renting a room in the house called 911 to say people were inside causing damage. Investigators say the group stole guns and valuables and set fire to the house. Noel Brennan, 9 News.
Hello and welcome to this week's very special episode of Who Killed. I am your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcasts, and Killer Podcast production. On this week's show, I am lucky enough to be joined by Colorado Public Radio reporter Elaine Tassy, and we are here to discuss the very intriguing case of one Maggie Long from 2017. Welcome to the show, Tassy.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I've been very intrigued by reading your stories about the case of 17-year-old Maggie Long out of Bailey, Colorado. And for the audience who don't know much about this case, can you give me a little bit of background? I know that you've been in the town, you've interviewed a lot of her family members and the community members and some of her former teachers. How did this all happen?
Yeah, well, let me try to explain some of the case to you. It was on December 1st of 2017, so almost exactly 7 years ago. Maggie Long was a high school student, and she is from a town called Bailey. It's about 40 miles from Denver. It's kind of a rural area. So on December 17th, she was at school, and then she went home, and then she was planning on going back to school. And she had gone home in order to get some snacks and stuff because there was going to be a concert later that day at her school. So she was going to bring the stuff back to the school with her. And she goes into the house, and she never comes back out. And so later that evening, like around 11 o'clock, the family was finally allowed to go into the house. They had been like waiting for hours to find out what had happened. And when they learned, that evening that she had been killed and that her body had been burned. And so Maggie is one of 3 sisters. They're an Asian family. And I first heard about the case actually right before I started working at Colorado Public Radio. And as I'm sure you know, in order to get a job as a reporter, you usually go into the interview with some stories that you know about that you could potentially do if you were hired. So as I was preparing for my interview for this job, I came across an article in the New York Times about the case. And so when I had my interview, I mentioned, that would be something that I'd be interested in looking at. And so when I was actually offered the position, they said, you remember that story that you mentioned during your interview? We'd really like for you to, take a look at it and go down there and talk to some people. So what I did was I found the contact information for one of her sisters. And in addition to interviewing her sisters, I also interviewed the principal of the high school that she had attended. And then I also talked to some people who were her friends. And I talked to the person who leads the theater company. There's a community theater in Bailey that she was involved with. And so I talked to the leader of that as well.
Yeah, and she was a very vibrant part of the, theater community. She was into acting. From the story that I read of yours, she kind of touched a lot of the people in that area. And I can only imagine being, a town of 9,000 and then Conifer, being small as well. Murder is probably not something that happens very often.
Right, you're right. It doesn't happen there very often. And between 2017 and now, there haven't really been that many leads that have been going anyplace for the police who are involved. So there are multiple agencies that have been involved in this case. And what I learned recently, about maybe 2 weeks ago, I heard that they had just decided, or that they were seeking to, get more people to be aware of the fact that there's a $75,000 reward for any leads in the case. But it still is unsolved. It doesn't seem as though they're any closer to suspects than they were when I first covered the story.
Yeah, the case, when I first heard about the case and, heard that it was possible, the questions are endless. But the girl goes into her house and she does not return, or she does not leave. And the house is robbed. There is a gun stolen, an AK-47, a Beretta, and a safe. So, I mean, there obviously was a robbery. The fact that they went to the extent of killing this young woman to cover up the crime seems so unnecessary. I mean, you never can put yourself in the mind of a killer, or, let's say it was a multiple person operation or whatever, but it's just hard to understand why they would make that choice and not just get out of there. And then another thing that stood out to me was the fact that they waited 6 weeks before they released the details about the case to the public. And I got a feeling, which I'm sure you did as well, that was sort of a frustrating thing for the family, because suspects aren't going to typically stick around the area where they just committed a horrific crime. So the rationale behind that is one that I won't understand.
Well, let me first answer the first part of your question having to do with... I'm sorry.
Well, she was a part of we talked about the community and...
oh, right, about the potential of a burglary taking place at the time that she had walked in. So, yeah, what I thought about was, so when she walked into the house, when she walked into her house, what was apparently taking place was there was a person or persons in the house at that moment, and they were in the course of burglarizing the house. And so I remember, like I told you before, I was a reporter in Baltimore in the 90s, and one of the cases that I remember covering there was a very similar situation where there was a burglary in the course of taking place, and this young, I think teenager or early 20-year-old person walked in, and the person who was committing the burglary shot and killed her. So it's not unheard of that the burglars would think, okay, well, rather than this person who has witnessed this being able to then go and tell people that she saw me here, I'll just kill her too. And obviously, it's not necessarily something that you or I would choose to do, but sometimes when a criminal act is in the course of taking place, the criminal thinks about things like, what do I need to do to keep anybody from catching me? And they may think that that would be the solution. Obviously, it ends up just making the situation a million times worse, because now you've got a secondary victim to, in addition to the fact that, the crime that you're in the process of committing, you've now made 100 times more serious. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the person in Maryland who had shot and killed somebody when he was in the course of doing a burglary, that became a death penalty eligible crime, whereas before, just the burglary alone would have been a sentence that he could have completed and then gone on with his life. So, yeah, that's one possibility, but there are a couple of other possibilities also. So one possibility is that it could have been a hate crime. That was one of the things that I think the New York Times article may have touched on that made it interesting for me, because they're an Asian family, and there have been a lot of instances where the motivation of a crime is that the person is Asian. Just like there have been crimes motivated by the fact that a person is Black, there have been in recent years people targeting Asian people for a reason I'm not exactly clear on, but just, sort of resentment about people from other countries living in this country. Sometimes Asian people are the targets of that. So without there being any suspects to question, you can't, ask them or find out more confidently if that could have been a motivating factor. But that's something that the police had considered.
Now, I did read that, and that actually was able to bring in some more resources by, I guess, recategorizing it as a hate crime. That brought in the FBI and the CBI, and that is a difference. But I also, from your reporting, kind of got the sense that there hasn't been much movement since they made that determination. And I think they were hoping that they were going to get something out of that. When you add more resources, I think anybody expects something to come out with it, or to have fresh eyes. The fresh eyes thing is interesting, though, right? Because you covered that.
Well, yeah, what I did was I spoke to the chief of the police department. I think he's actually a sheriff in Platte County, which is the name of the county that the crime occurred in, right? So he told me that in addition to local law enforcement people being involved, that federal law enforcement also was looking at it, as well as the Colorado Bureau of Investigations, like you just said. And you would think that classifying the crime as a hate crime, getting, the feds involved too, would make the investigation have more momentum and therefore perhaps lead to an arrest or a suspect. But that hasn't been the case in this case either, which is sort of why I think it's really compelling to a lot of people that you have additional resources, you have, people who are talking about it more because of media coverage. But like you said, after the crime happened, there was this gap in time before there were press releases and stuff that would let people know, here's who we think might be a potential suspect. And by the time the press release came out, people, first of all, had lost the initial spark that the knowledge of the murder had brought when it happened. And then, like you said, also, the people who had done it are given the opportunity to flee the area. So that just makes it all the more difficult.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I can't imagine what the family must have been going through at that time. I can imagine that they were very frustrated, and I can assume that they're still in that same state. And, without answers for a crime, I've interviewed a number of family members who've lost, children or a sibling or whatnot. And it is a hole that is never going to be filled, even if they do find the killer. We try not to talk about closure because there's never going to be closure in something like that. Resolution, I kind of volley back and forth the same sort of like a okay word to say, but it just...
Well, I don't think that the family or the people that she went to school with got any closure or resolution.
No, that's definitely not.
And one of the things that I remembered as like a really interesting detail, when I went to her high school, I got a chance to meet with the principal, and I believe he might have played the role of not only principal but also coach. Actually, it's not Platte County. I misspoke. It's actually Park County. Okay. That's the county that she's from. But the principal of her school told me that she had been involved in sports, possibly softball there, and he said that they had retired her number and put her shirt that she, with the number for her place on the team is now like behind this glass case, and the number that she had isn't going to be assigned to anybody else on the team, as one way to, keep her memory alive. And when I talked to her two sisters, they were both, it felt like they weren't able to really feel like they could get any completion on their grief because there are so many unanswered questions. And they talked about like the violence that that she experienced. I'm actually looking at the story right now, and one of her sisters, this is what she said in a quote. She said, I think we need to be very clear that Maggie was murdered in a very violent, heinous manner. She was essentially burned alive, Connie Long said, and anyone who could do something to our sister who did not deserve it at all is a threat to the community. So even though there hasn't been like a concise or complete narrative of exactly what happened inside the house, I mean, just from what her sister told me, I mean, it just sounds like the worst, horrible way to, I mean, you just so innocently walk into your own home. It was a 6,000-foot a 6,000 square foot ranch style house, and it was
Yeah, we're not talking
located.
small.
Not only was it a very large house, but it was also very, very remotely located. So in order to get to the house from the county road that it's located on, you have to go a quarter mile from the road to the house. Like their driveway is about a quarter of a mile long. And so whoever was there, it's not like anybody can really hear from the house to the street, being that it's that far away. And then when she went into the house, I'm pretty sure that there was nobody but her and whoever was in the course of doing the burglary in the house. Her family owned Chinese and I believe Thai restaurants. And so they were at work at the time. And then there was a tenant who lived in the house, but not in the house. Like they didn't share space with the family. They had like a unit that was separated from the rest of the house. But the person who was living in that apartment within the house was able to hear some of what happened, but wasn't able to physically like go to her aid.
So I was wondering about the tenant because I know that, he was cleared or whomever was cleared, or at least that's what the article stated, or at least what I came across. And I just thought it was interesting that they were able, they have a 6,000 square foot place and they're renting out a place on their property. You mentioned the property being off the beaten path. And when you have a house that's one that large and off the beaten path, you kind of feel like somebody has to know where that house is. And it would just make sense if you would think, there's a house up on a hill that's away from everything. You can go commit a crime up there and not really take the chance of getting caught. It seems almost like a crime of opportunity, but a planned crime of opportunity because you
right. Well, I would think that a person who wanted to select a property to burglarize, maybe driving along the county road that they lived on, maybe they would think like this would be the sort of property that nobody would be able to, to be aware of it. But I'm not supposed to do any speculation, so I shouldn't say anything more.
No, I understand completely. And on speculation in regards to cases and cold cases, it generally doesn't do any good for most situations. It actually makes things worse because you send people on red herrings, and it's just it's not helpful. I covered a case where one of the most famous profilers, Robert Ressler, wrote in his book about a case that I covered that he speculated about this guy being the murderer. And it was a murder of a 10-year-old girl, and this guy had committed suicide shortly after. And Ressler had only come up for a weekend to help look over a couple things. And he concluded in a book that he published that was a bestseller stating that, and so that fact, he was not connected. And so for 15 years or so, until somebody wrote a book about the case, people were kind of under the impression that this one individual was probably the killer. And it's like, just when you do that, it's very hard for people to undo and unsee what they've seen. So I appreciate you're not speculating, and that's fine, and it's totally understandable. I just think it's very interesting to think that if you were driving down, would you even see her house if you were driving down the road, like if a main road?
As I recall, driving down the main road, you would not necessarily see the house itself. And that kind of leads you to wonder, let me not wonder. What I was going to tell you also is that you had asked a little bit about like how her family was affected by it. And one of the things that I remember her sisters telling me is that her parents were restaurant owners, like I said, and they had been thinking about retiring. But her sister Connie told me that Maggie's death really, like, made them decide to retire for good. And the night they died, the night that Maggie died, they stopped working and they never went back to the restaurant. And so they were, really just so devastated that they couldn't, carry on with their careers. And then I also spoke to this man named Nelson Conway, and he's the head of the theater group that she belonged to. Mm-hmm. And he was mentioning that in addition to what you had mentioned about them not issuing a press release until February, which was about 6 weeks after her murder, the people who were close to Maggie were told that they weren't supposed to talk to anybody for like about a week or so. And that would include, like, if somebody had asked one of Maggie's sisters to do an interview, she was supposed to say no, which also kind of makes you, just creates some distance between when the
memories aren't as fresh.
Yeah, right.
You tell the family and friends not to talk to one another about it's almost like you're doing a disservice to the investigation right off the bat. And I'm not one to Monday morning quarterback the police very often, and I'm not going to here because they're a small town and they're not used to this type of stuff. But the situation still remains the same, is that they let valuable time slip by where some of this information should have been out there quicker. And I do think that if they would have been collaborating with everybody about what they may have seen or heard and done, you can only sit here 7 years later and feel that pain for that mom and that dad. And
yeah, exactly, because I'm looking at the story right now, and Connie, the sister, this is what she said 4.5 years after the crime happened. She goes, over the last 4.5 years, it's from our experience shown that there aren't any developments, and part of us wonders, is that due to the nature of the case, lack of evidence, or is it perhaps due to lack of effort and interest by individuals in department that are located in Bailey? She wondered. So that was one of the things that she told me when I interviewed her. And then it was classified as a hate crime in May of 2021. So it wasn't like, right after the crime happened, there was some time that passed. And so that reclassification added additional financial resources as well as the involvement of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI. But that hadn't impacted the investigation. And yeah, like I said, it's, still something that's ongoing, still unsolved.
Yeah, and it's such a tragedy for the parents who, when you own a restaurant, I think anybody who's known people that have owned restaurants, it's a very social, you're usually interacting with customers. It's the face of the restaurant typically. And to immediately step back from that way of life is so sad, because they won't and will never ever feel the same that they did the day before this happened. And that's the tragedy here.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I thought was so touching about the relationship that Maggie was able to form with her family members and some of her close friends is that she was somebody who really liked elephant knickknacks and little trinkets and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. She liked to collect them. So a couple of her loved ones got little elephant tattoos as a way to, hold her memory close.
That's cute. I like that. That's a nice way of remembering somebody.
Yeah, actually one of her sisters left a little elephant knickknack at her grave as a way to just, let everyone know that was something that was special to her.
Yeah, I mean, she seems like she was a person that had nothing but a bright future ahead of her, and somebody or some people made sure that that wasn't going to happen, and it wasn't any fault of her own. She just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it is a tragedy that this case remains unsolved. I really do appreciate your reporting on this case. And, you know, when the case comes on anniversaries, obviously I've covered a lot of cases, it helps generate new information, and it does spark interest and reinvigorate people about the case. And I'm hoping that this also does, you know, doing podcasts and talking about her case and just letting it be known that, you know, this was a robbery, but this was also the murder of a high school girl. And this is the worst nightmare situation for any child to, like you said, innocently walk into her house. She had no reason to think anything was wrong. And then she doesn't ever get to come out. It's such a sad case.
It is really sad. And one thing I wanted to leave you with is there's a task force that's still active. It's called the Maggie Long Task Force, and they have a tip line. And so let me just tell you what the tip line phone number is, just in case maybe some of your audience members have a tip and they want to share it. The number is 303-239-4243.
Excellent. I will also provide that in the show notes. And I will also provide links to your stories on her case. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, we just have to hope that they are able to... I guess I have one final question before we go. Do you know if they have any physical evidence, like DNA or anything along those lines?
I don't know that.
Okay. Yeah, and since I hadn't seen that anywhere, my guess was it had probably been lost in the fire. So anyway, I do hope that they continue to look into possible leads and are still doing what they're doing. I just want this to be a resolution for the Long family and for that community. It's just very tragic, and I feel for them and feel for what they go through. And it's great that you're able to bring her story to light, and I really appreciate you coming on this show to talk about her case. And before you go,
my pleasure. Just let me leave you with one little tidbit that I remember from her sister. She said that every year on the anniversary of her death, her sister Connie would go through her personal stuff, and Maggie's birthday was going to come like a few weeks later. She was about to turn 18. A few weeks, like her birthday, I think, was December 17th, and she was killed December 1st. So her sister said that she opened up her computer and found a note that Maggie had written to herself for when she would turn 18, which would just be 2 weeks after she was murdered. And she said that she had written a message to herself that said, "No matter what you decide to do with your life, just be a good person."
It's so sad, but such a good thing to remember, and that her sisters are able to carry on. And again, Tassy, I just appreciate you coming on and making this case, I guess, national and keeping it national. And again, you have worked for the Baltimore Sun, and you currently work for Colorado Public Radio, and anywhere else people can find your stuff?
Well, I'm on Blue Sky now. That's where I post my stories. So the work I did on the Maggie Long story and the stories that I have done since joining Blue Sky and the ones that are coming out this week, they'll all be there.
Awesome. Awesome stuff. Well, Tassy, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, Bill, thanks so much for having me on. It was a pleasure talking to you too.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you to Tassy, Elaine Tassy of Colorado Public Radio, for joining me this week during a very busy time in her schedule to discuss the case of Maggie Long. Tassy is a former reporter of the Baltimore Sun and is with Colorado Public Radio now. and she has covered Maggie's case a couple of times, and she has spoken with a number of people related to the case. So I appreciate her coming on this week and talking about this very important case that remains unsolved. So thank you to the listeners for joining me this week for a brand new episode of Who Killed. And again, trying to drop new episodes every Friday. As long as the content's good, I'm happy to do so. And as you know, there's been a lot of crazy things going on with the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO, the arrest of Luigi Mangione, and the circumstances surrounding all of that case are pretty wild. We do have a lot of other stuff that's going on, but again, this is the holiday season, and it is the season to be merry. So I try not to bring you down too much, but this is a pertinent case and one that definitely needs the attention, and these suspects are somewhere, and they have stolen an AK-47, a Beretta, a safe. So if you have come across any of these items in a pawn shop or in your daily life, you can reach out to the tip line that Tassy had read out right before we signed off. And I will also provide that number in the source notes. So again, thank you so much for listening this week. And if you want to follow me on Blue Sky, you can do so. Just look up Bill Huffman. And other than that, as always, until next time, be healthy and stay safe.
I'm an American vigilante. I have a question for you. What would you do if someone you cared about was abducted, taken from you? Would you call me? Would you care about how I got them back? Download American Vigilante now.
When you're part of a military family, you understand sacrifice and support. At American Public University, we honor your dedication by extending our military tuition savings to your extended family. Parents, spouses, legal partners, siblings, and dependents all qualify for APU's preferred military rate of just $250 per credit hour for undergraduate and master's level programs. American Public University. Value for the whole family. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.